Hi, do you know about the trolley problem? It's a thought experiment where you have a train track bifurcating in two, and on each branch there are people bound to the track. On the first branch there are 5 people bound, while on the second there is only 1. Now a train is coming and it can't brake in time to avoid them. However, you're right by the switch that can change which track the train is going to take. You don't know these people or why they are bound, so we assume they are equivalent. For now the train is headed to the track which has 5 people, but you can divert it to make it take the track which only has 1 person. So, should you flip the switch or not? Your answer would be largely determined by your philosophical stance as either a consequentialist or a deontologist. The idea behind consequentialism is that the valence of an action, that is, how good or bad it is solely determined by the consequences it generates. Contrarily, deontological ethics posits that actions of a certain category can be considered to always be either good or bad, irrespectively of the consequences generated in any particular instance. By the way, while consequentialism is an accepted word, deontologism is not, so you're supposed to say deontological ethics instead. You can't say deontology because that's not a philosophical stance, rather it's a word that means something like the rules of a procedure. But I find deontological ethics needlessly cumbersome, so I will absolutely allow myself to say deontologism instead. I very much advocate for coining a neologism when there is a need for one. So classically, ethics was based on religion, and religion has a chiefly deontological view of ethics. The concept of sin is a particularly flagrant example of this. Certain behaviors are considered wrong independently of any consequence it might generate. For instance, sex out of wedlock was considered inherently bad, even if no diseases were transmitted and no babies conceived. There are several different subtypes of consequentialism, most prominent of which is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the notion that the best actions are those that maximize the well-being of all conscious beings. I imagine many people would consider this a self-evident truth, but it was in fact quite unorthodox to fully spell it out at the time, considering that this position exists at odds with religion, or at least Abrahamic religions, the religions revolving around the god Yahweh, comprising most importantly Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and which I like to consider as a single religion called Yahwehism. Utilitarianism is essentially incompatible with Yahwehism since it clearly paints Yahweh as an evil agent, given that this deity intentionally generates outcomes that don't provide the maximum well-being for all. Yahweh is conceived as being all-powerful and all-knowing, and yet it still lets much suffering happen. And in fact doesn't just let it happen, but makes it happen, since Yahweh created everything and knew what would happen, and has the power to intervene at any time. And he even directly makes people suffer through supernatural mechanisms. This is again why you cannot be moral if you worship Yahweh. There are plenty of other places online where you can read about the consequentialism versus deontologism debate, and in fact that's where I found out about it. So if I make this video, it's not only to present these different positions, but to take sides. And by that I really mean to inform you which position is correct. And that position is, Drumrolls, consequentialism. Of course. And yes, more specifically, utilitarianism. To me, an action is meaningless when deprived of context. You need context to know whether a particular action is good or bad. And this is something that deontologists subconsciously know as well. Think about it this way. Is plunging a knife into solid always a good or a bad thing? Of course it can be one or the other, depending on what specific thing that knife is going into. If it's a vegetable, it means you're probably preparing food, which typically is a good thing. Although, of course, in some instances it might not be. If you're preparing food for the Nazi Party, that's wrong. But overall, it's a good or at least mostly neutral thing. Meanwhile, if your knife is going into a living human, it's probably a bad thing. It means you're stabbing the person. But of course, here again, it's not always a bad thing. Indeed, if you're a surgeon, you have to stick knives into people all the time, even if it's not quite the same motion as stabbing. Any deontologist would have to realize that it makes no sense to say plunging knives into solids is always good or always bad. But yet they make that exact mistake by defending deontologism. That is because no two actions are ever completely identical, which means that lumping any multiple actions into a single category, which is then deemed either good or bad, amounts to denying the specificities of each particular instance. And hence this is qualitatively indistinguishable from a ridiculous statement like plunging knives into solids is always bad. A classic refutation of a particular deontological stance, namely that lying is always bad, is the case of a would-be murderer asking you for the whereabouts of its would-be innocent victim. Typically, a Nazi asking you for the location of a Jew. And I don't think most deontologists would seriously advocate for telling the truth in that situation, at least presuming that the murderer wouldn't harm you for not telling the truth. Basically, when confronted with actual situations, deontologism breaks down, and its proponents have to grudgingly resort to consequentialist viewpoint without even admitting, even to themselves, that that's what they're doing. Deontologism is so preposterous that it's not even mistaken. Rather, it's more akin to a mental illness. It's a manifestation of psychosis, of madness. And because it promotes a false understanding of ethics, which leads people to making the wrong decisions, deontologism is downright harmful as well. Utilitarianism comprises several distinct subtypes. You have some people contend that it's better to minimize total suffering, while others prefer to maximize total pleasure. Meanwhile, others want to minimize relative suffering or maximize relative pleasure. I don't think there is any one perfect answer to this, although overall I think it's most important to minimize total suffering. And so now let's return to the trolley problem. There is only one good answer. It's not a debate. In this situation, the answer does not depend on the subtype of utilitarianism, since we're only concerned about minimizing pain, not maximizing pleasure, and since here relative suffering and total suffering go hand in hand. The answer is that you should flip the switch and make the train hit the single person instead of the 5 as it was going to. Again, we're making implicit postulates that these people are interchangeable and that their death is a bad thing. Sure, a case could be made for the fact that when you're dead you maybe don't suffer anymore, so in fact making someone die is a good thing, but we're going to ignore that. If you prefer, you can pretend that all the people hit by the train would survive, but with severe irreversible damage. And obviously there could be complicating factors at play. For instance, if one of the people on the tracks was highly influential and its death would have wide-scale repercussions. But we assume that there aren't any complications of the sort, and that all the individuals are equal and interchangeable. The main idea is that having 5 person experience something bad is worse than having 1 person experience something bad, and that changing the course of events to generate an outcome that makes more people happy is a good thing, even if it means making some people unhappy who wouldn't have been otherwise. The way to understand this is to realize that not doing something is also a choice. Not flipping the switch is just as much of a choice as flipping it. That's in fact an issue that comes up quite often when it comes to human rights. You have a government that commits some harmful actions against certain people, and the majority of the population does nothing. And then some people might rightly decry their inaction, and their excuse is simply, we did nothing. And if they did nothing, that means in their eyes that they couldn't have done anything wrong. But that's not the right way of seeing things. If you did nothing when you could have done something, that's a choice. Ethics doesn't only evaluate active choices, it also evaluates passive ones. In Switzerland, I know that non-assistance to a person in danger is a recognized crime, and rightly so. Now, there have been studies to determine people's answers to the trolley problem, seemingly beginning with a 1976 study by a certain J.J. Thomson. And apparently, a majority of people did indeed favor flipping the switch. But there are plenty who didn't. And I know there's a study which investigated people's answers to both the classic version of the trolley problem and a particular variant, and the results were quite revealing. Revealing of people's idiocy, that is. This particular variant of the problem replaces the second track to which a single person is bound with a single person on a bridge spanning a single track instead. In this scenario, there is a single track with 5 people bound to it, and a bridge going over the track a bit ahead of where the people are bound. You are on the bridge with this person, and this person is a lot heavier than you. So heavy, in fact, that if it fell on the track, it would stop the train before it reached the 5 people who are bound to the track. The bridge also happens to not have any guardrails, and the heavy person is close to the edge and right above the track. So again, you have a decision to make. In this case, do I push this person overboard? Again, the logical answer is yes, since the net result is the same as before. 1 new death for 5 people saved, so a net 4 people saved. However, as it turns out, a majority of people in the study now decline to push the heavy person onto the track. A large number of people switched their answer even though the situation is identical for all practical purposes. This illustrates that many people are truly crazy. They are crazy both for switching from their previous position, and also simply for not wanting to push the person irrespectively of any previous answer. So it's not just switching that's crazy. See, the authors of the study pointed out that many people are inconsistent in their beliefs and thus agree with me that they are crazy, even though I imagine they wouldn't agree with my particular choice of words. However, they didn't consider it problematic that some people always decline to act. As long as the answer was consistent in both situations, they consider the position valid. I completely disagree. The people who decline to act are adhering to a deontologist principle that states that killing humans is always bad. The absurd thing is that this principle doesn't just say that killing is always bad, but rather it also says that letting people die when you could have prevented it is perfectly okay as long as you're not actively killing someone. It's a completely irrational understanding of ethics whereby the only thing that matters is the actual physical movements that you perform, as opposed to the very serious consequences that result from your choices. Literally, it means that killing people by inaction is okay, because you didn't actually perform a physical movement. You didn't voluntarily contract your muscles to make your limbs move so as to cause someone's death. It's truly insane. There is a funny final observation that was made in this study. And that's what types of people did in fact favor action over inaction, and thus a net result of 4 lives saved. Admittedly, this wasn't actually a result of this study, but was rather an anecdotal account of the results of other studies on the same subject. Anyway, I still think it's worthwhile to mention because I have no doubt that there is at least a strong element of truth to this, so here goes. The 3 types of people who typically say that you should kill 1 person to save 5 are psychopaths, economists, and Buddhist monks. At first glance, this would seem to represent a particularly eclectic group, but actually there is a common quality that unites these 3 types, and that is rationality. These are people who are considerably more rational than average. And this makes them actually better people, so to speak, at least in a theoretical situation. When faced with a situation described in the bridge variant of the trolley problem, these people saved a net 4 lives, while most people killed a net 4 lives. Just having goody two-shoes feelings and wanting to do the right thing doesn't really make you a good person if you don't even know what the right thing is. It's also quite ironic that psychopaths, who typically get demonized by the mainstream, actually turn out to be better people than most. Although of course this is only true if they actually want to do good. And this is because psychopaths actually better understand good and evil. And hence, if they do evil, it's because they don't care, unlike most people who do evil because they don't understand. It's important to realize, however, that you don't need to be a psychopath to be rational. What is psychopathy? Or psychopathy? I don't know how you say that. It's mostly about not having obvious emotions, including not being able to empathize with others as a result. And what can make them dangerous is that they feel no remorse. The reason they are more rational is that they largely aren't liable to being biased by emotions, which are notoriously irrational. But they do additionally have a tendency to think more analytically as well. However, I want to emphasize that it's perfectly possible to have a rich emotional experience and still be rational. The fact that Buddhist monks answer the same as psychopaths upholds this. And the fact that I answer the same upholds this as well. I am super sensitive, and if I don't feel that many emotions nowadays, it's mostly because I've repressed them to keep it together. I am nothing like a psychopath. I am emotionally sensitive, and yet I think rationally like them, and indeed even considerably more so. And this particular trait is actually what makes me unique. This is what I was referring to in my first video. I have much evidence to believe that, amazingly enough, I am likely the most rational person on Earth, and certainly more rational than almost everyone else at least. And as such, it is obvious to me that engaging in practical utilitarianism is the best thing anyone can do, and so that is what I'm doing now. Bye.